Hey everyone. So I wanted to get in here and provide some astrological commentary on a recent viral video that took place in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The gist of it is, if you haven't seen it, I'll put a link in the description box or in the comment section. But the gist of it is a 75-year-old woman by the name of Anita Grayson entered a Tim Hortons establishment. I guess it's like a coffee shop, and I presumed that she was going to raise concern over an incorrect order. But what we can see, because we can't really hear, there's no audio, but we can see her castigating the 70-year-old worker before a 20-year-old shift lead intervenes and basically forms a barrier between the elderly woman and the teenage girl. But once she intervenes, Miss Grayson became even more irate, and the shift lead can be seen, like, again, like forming a barrier between the teenage employee and the elderly woman. She kind of put her hands out to stop the woman, but the elderly woman must have taken this as an attack, so she reacted by pushing her and punching the shift lead in the face, which led which led to a full-on brawl between the shift lead and the elderly woman. And as you can imagine, the elderly woman did not get the better end of that fight. So afterwards, they, were separated, and the woman kind of sat around for a while and very quickly became unresponsive and was taken to the hospital where she later expired. So I wanted to look at the astrology of that particular event because we know how it began and we know how it ended. So I want to see if I can match the astrology to that actual event. So I cast a chart for the moment she entered the establishment. And what we can see is that Gemini is rising and Venus is closely conjoined to the ascendant. And so one thing about Gemini is all about words and the things that you say. And so while we could not hear what was going on, based on the chart, we can deduce that the words that were exchanged in the situation, likely from, Miss Grayson to the employees, played a huge role in how the event manifested. Like her harsh language, her berating them, and her being very irate is what contributed to the event turning basically fatal. Um, Now I will say that with Venus rising, I would typically prefer to see this under, merrier circumstances, but nonetheless, Venus can be interpreted as describing the environment as being heavily influenced by women. And in a dual sign such as Gemini, it can represent the two female workers or two young women. The environment taking place inside of a restaurant is also very Venus coded. But when we delineate Venus through her specific rulership of the 12th house, this more accurately pretends an event that is sorrowful because the 12th house is the house of subterfuge, self undoing, sorrow, and bad spirit. It is the house of Saturn. Saturn has his joy in this house. And so, if the planet that is rising in a chart is ruling the 12th house, that typically is not a positive omen. And now, when we look at the ruler of the ascendant, Mercury, Mercury is also in the unfortunate 12th house and lies under the beams of the sun. So, this is doubly involving the 12th house and showing that this is going to be an event that is sorrowful. Now, when I parse this out, I view Mercury as representing the teenage worker, and the Sun is representing the shift leader that took over. And I find this to be a literal manifestation of a planet being under the beams of the Sun. Often, the sun will take over whichever planet is under the beams or under combustion. And because the sun rules authority figures, we can use the sun to represent the shift leader who, stood in front of the teenage worker and basically took Mrs. Grayson head on. So I found that to be very striking symbolism. And that is why I assigned the ascendant to the two workers, and I assigned the seventh house to the elderly woman, Anita Grayson. Now, speaking of the seventh house, Jupiter rules the seventh house, and it is in the radical second house. And the interesting thing about that is the second house is 8 places away from the seventh house. So Jupiter is in the turned eighth house, and this very clearly illustrates the death of Mrs. Grayson. She's the one who died in the situation, and so her being in her derived eighth house makes a lot of sense, and it supports the idea that in this chart she is being represented by the descendant. Another thing that's interesting is that Jupiter is in the sign of its exaltation. And planets that are exalted can act with exaggeration and inflated self assurance. This usually manifests as a person who feels like that they can act with an air of arrogance and superiority. And in this, in my opinion, this will reflects Anita's apoplectic demeanor, as though her elderly status entitled her authority over the young women. We can see that Mars is separated from a square with Jupiter, which further emphasizes her bellicose temperament, but it can also represent a recent medical procedure because Mars deals with medical procedures, and Mars in this chart is governing the sixth house. So Mars has to deal with that. Mars Jupiter square can deal with her medical procedure, which likely played a role, or I'm sure it played a role in her demise, because she ended up dying of a congestive heart failure because she'd had a heart transplant, I believe, like a couple days prior. So, real talk, she should have been in there carrying on the way that she was. I mean, given her age and her deleterious health, she probably shouldn't have been drinking coffee in the first place. But she definitely shouldn't have been in there raising hell the way that she was, because at the end of the day, your age nor your health status grants you the right to berate and attack other people. But I find it interesting that Mars is separated from that Jupiter, and she had had that medical procedure. Um, and it's just again very likely that following the altercation, she probably aggravated her deleterious heart, and the emotional and physical excitement of the dispute is probably what led to her demise, her unfortunate demise, because this is very unfortunate. Now, I also observed the Moon Saturn conjunction in the 11th house, and I also said that this represents Anita because the Moon represents women and Saturn represents the elderly. And with the conjunction being in Aries, it can represent the elderly woman's waspish temperament. And so the fact that this conjunction was in the sky at the time just highlights older women in general. But Moon Saturn can also point to difficulties involving women, a difficult woman. She was being very difficult. Unfortunate circumstances involving women, and the loss of a woman. So Moon Saturn in Aries, just shows that, you know, that can literally translate when you look at it from a planet to sign perspective, that translates to an elderly woman that is angry. And Neptune being there close to the moon certainly doesn't help either. Now, what's interesting is when we examine the specific rulerships